If you've ever read the Bible, you may have noticed that there's this odd ritual called baptism that appears suddenly in the New Testament. In fact, many times the New Testament says that baptism is essential to being a follower of Christ. But the question is, why? What's so important about a ritual dunking in water, and if it is so important, why does it show up only near the end of the Bible? Well, first it's important to answer what baptism even is. The English word baptism comes from the Greek word baptizo, which means to dip, immerse, or submerge. In ancient times, this word often referred to submerging garments in a dye in order to change their color. Simply put, the physical act of baptism is a full water submersion, which, by the way, contradicts the widespread practice of sprinkling. But submersion is only the first step of baptism. The second step, which is equally critical, is belief. As it says in Mark 16, "He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved." So that's what baptism is, a full submersion in water of someone who sincerely believes the gospel. But what we really want to consider in this video is why baptism is so important. Because if we don't know why we're being baptized, we're simply taking a bath. So baptism only occurs in the New Testament. But that being said, it shares its significance and finds one of its first forms in the Old Testament law of circumcision. Now, like baptism, circumcision appears odd and strangely ritualistic. Why would God make such a big deal about having every male cut off their foreskin? Well, in Genesis 17, God gave his reasoning. Just after having given the covenants of promise to Abraham, God commanded Abraham to be circumcised as a token of the covenant. In other words, it was a daily reminder and acknowledgement that Abraham and God had made a covenant together. But while the circumcision was this physical representation of the covenant, it was also intended to mean something much more. Later on, Moses told the people of Israel that the true intention of circumcision was that they should circumcise the foreskin of their hearts and be no more stiff-necked. Going further, God said that he would circumcise their hearts so that they would love the Lord their God with all their hearts and soul, and so that they might live. So while the physical act of circumcision had to be done, and it was commanded by God, the whole point of it was that in cutting off a part of their flesh, they were reminding themselves that they must obey God and cut off whatever thing in their lives was causing them to disobey. Now, what does that have to do with baptism? Well, you can think of circumcision as the original baptism, at least in principle. But while circumcision and baptism taught many of the same ideas, circumcision had some very key limitations. For instance, only a male could be circumcised. And since it was done at a very young age, there was no deliberate choice. There was not that aspect of belief involved. It also wasn't something that could act as a public witness for God. And finally, the Jews eventually twisted circumcision into this marker of righteousness, completely forgetting the point. Paul had to remind them that he is a Jew, which is one inwardly, and that circumcision is that of the heart. Well, baptism didn't have those same limitations, and that's why it was introduced in the New Testament. Now, circumcision wasn't the only Old Testament counterpart to baptism. In fact, there was another early form of baptism that in many ways appeared to be very similar. Under the law of Moses, the ancient Israelites were repeatedly told to immerse themselves in water to wash away their uncleanness. And uncleanness was very common under the law. The law imparted ritual uncleanness for things like touching a dead body. It imparted uncleanness every month for women. It imparted uncleanness for sex and for conception. All kinds of activities, some of which were essential to continuing the existence of humanity, they were seen under the law as bringing uncleanness. And so the solution was that when an individual became unclean, they had to fully immerse themselves in water. And so essentially, although baptism may feel sudden or surprising in the New Testament, it was really just an extension of practices that had already existed in the Jewish community historically. Yet again, it wasn't exactly the same. While baptism, like ritual immersion, removes uncleanness, it goes a lot further than that. Baptism brought together both this ritual immersion and circumcision into a much more complete concept. Unlike immersion, one only has to be baptized once rather than every single time they become unclean. Unlike circumcision, baptism doesn't limit gender, ethnicity, or status. Paul says that as many of you as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither bond nor free. There is neither male nor female. For ye are all one in Christ Jesus. There also isn't a specific age required to be baptized. And so while circumcision had to be performed on the 8th day, baptism is something done when an individual comes to understand the gospel and believes. We also mentioned how circumcision wasn't a public witness to others. But baptism, on the other hand, it's an incredible public act of faith. In Acts 2, for example, when 3,000 people were baptized on the same day, it was a public declaration that these people believed the gospel. Now, there's one more important thing about baptism that really makes it clear why it's commanded. Remember when God instituted circumcision as the token of the covenant that he had made with Abraham? Well, in the same way, baptism is a token of a covenant. In Romans 6, Paul says, "Know ye not that so many of us as were baptized into Jesus Christ were baptized into his death? Therefore, we are buried with him by baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life." In other words, baptism is a symbol of our promise to God to follow in Jesus' footsteps. It represents a covenant with God. When someone is baptized, it's a public confession that they have chosen to put sin to death in their lives, just like Jesus did. And just like Jesus rose from the dead, they too will come out of the water and choose to live a new way of life, dedicated to the will of God. Now, of course, we'll always need help following Jesus. He was, and he will be, the only one who followed God perfectly. But the beauty of baptism is that when we enter into this covenant with God, as long as we maintain the repentant spirit he is looking for, God is always willing to forgive. So that's baptism, a covenant of water submersion that publicly declares one's intention to follow in Christ's footsteps. As we said though, baptism requires both action and faith. And so if you're interested in learning more about what faith is and why that's so important, then make sure to watch this video right here.